Don't call me. I'm not your property. Her text read, sharp and cold, and John stared at it, the words echoing louder than the room around him, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief that this was the woman he had once trusted completely, the woman who shared his mornings, his dinners, and his dreams. He set his phone down slowly, not wanting to react impulsively, and walked toward the window overlooking the city skyline, the early winter sun casting long shadows across his polished office floor, making the ordinary feel strangely cinematic, as if the world paused just to witness his internal struggle. And he thought back to the mornings when they had laughed over coffee, when Sarah's smile could light up the dimmest corners of his apartment, and now, that same smile seemed like a memory from another life. A life where understanding and patience had existed in tandem with love. He recalled the countless nights of discussions, sometimes heated, sometimes tender, and wondered at which point the small fissures had widened into a canyon too vast to cross, a canyon of mistrust, silent resentments, and unspoken disappointments. And the irony struck him, that here he was, the same man who had once given everything to build a stable foundation for their marriage, now faced with a digital note, a modern-day ultimatum that tested the limits of his composure and dignity. He sipped his black coffee, bitter and grounding, letting the warmth settle into his hands, and he considered how every moment since their last confrontation had been a delicate balance of civility and restrained emotion, each phone call avoided, each social encounter measured carefully to prevent further escalation. Yet the sting of the words lingered like a shadow that refused to recede. He remembered the message she sent last week, the subtle hints that she was planning something without him, the unease that had been simmering beneath the surface, now manifesting into clarity, and he realized that this wasn't just about a message. It was about boundaries, self-respect, and the unspoken need to reclaim agency over his own life. And as he looked back at the phone, he imagined the scenarios that could unfold, the potential meetings, the conversations fraught with tension, the careful dance of saying exactly enough without revealing the vulnerability that threatened to surface. And he felt the surge of determination to navigate the coming days with strategic thought and measured responses, acknowledging that his emotions, though real and raw, would need to be tempered with deliberate actions, a plan that honored his self-worth while confronting the awkward, uncomfortable reality of human relationships. And in that moment, John understood that the path forward required both patience and assertiveness, a blend of strength and careful reflection as he prepared to engage with a world that could be indifferent, mocking, or unaware of the depths of the personal turmoil behind a simple line of text. Yet he resolved to maintain his poise, his integrity, and his vision for a life that balanced empathy with self-preservation, knowing that each decision from this point on would shape not only his present interactions, but the trajectory of his emotional resilience and future stability. And he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle into a quiet clarity, readying himself for the encounters, conversations, and choices that lay ahead in the unfolding story of his life and his attempts to reconcile personal dignity with complex human connections. John did not answer Sarah's text right away because he knew the first reply after a wound is often the least honest one. Anger wants speed. Dignity prefers structure. He left the phone on his desk and walked through the quiet office, past framed licenses, financial reports, and the long conference table where men in expensive suits often listened to him with a respect his own wife had slowly forgotten how to give. Outside, the city moved beneath a pale winter sky, office workers crossing at the light with paper coffee cups in their hands, delivery trucks idling near the curb, the ordinary machinery of a weekday continuing as if one sentence had not just shifted the foundation under his marriage. His name was John Whitman, 43 years old, a commercial property investor in Denver, and the irony of Sarah's message would have been almost funny if it had not landed so cold. Property was the word she chose, as if he had ever treated her like an object, as if the house she slept in, the car she drove, the medical bills he covered for her father, and the business courses he paid for had been chains instead of choices he made, because love, at its best, is supposed to protect without keeping score. But Sarah had become talented at turning his care into control whenever responsibility started feeling inconvenient. He remembered the first time she said it. They were standing in the kitchen 6 months earlier, rain tapping against the skylight, while she packed for a weekend trip to Aspen with friends John barely knew. He had asked why the hotel reservation was under another man's name, a marketing consultant named Brandon Cole who had been appearing too often in her stories and disappearing whenever John entered the room. Sarah had laughed then, not warmly, but with practiced disbelief. "You are paranoid," she said. "You think paying the mortgage means you own me." That sentence had stunned him more than any confession would have. He had not mentioned the mortgage. She had. Guilt often brings its own vocabulary. Since then, the pattern sharpened. She came home later. Her phone stayed face down. She started calling his questions interrogations and his silence emotional punishment. When he suggested counseling, she said she needed space. When he gave her space, she said he was cold. When he called to check whether she was coming home for dinner, she said he was monitoring her. The marriage had become a hallway where every door opened into an accusation. That morning, John had called once, only once, after Sarah failed to come home the night before, and the security system showed the front door had not opened since she left at 7:12 in the evening. He was not demanding. He was not shouting. He left a message that said, "Call me when you can. I need to know you are safe." 10 minutes later, her text arrived. "Do not call me. I am not your property." He read it again now from across the office, the screen lighting up with the same sharp little sentence. Then he opened the home security app, the banking portal, and the property files tied to the house in Cherry Creek. Not because he wanted to punish her, but because clarity had finally arrived wearing the clothes of disrespect. The house had been his before the marriage, purchased through Whitman Holdings 3 years before he met Sarah. Her name was not on the deed. The Range Rover was leased through his company. The credit cards she used for spa weekends, boutique shopping, and last month's unexplained mountain resort charges were tied to an account he had never restricted because he believed trust should not require locks. Belief had become expensive. John sat at his desk, took a slow breath, and opened a new email to his attorney, Rebecca Lawson. He typed carefully, "Please prepare a separation notice, access review for my premarital residence, and freeze all non-essential authorized user charges pending written confirmation." He attached the relevant property documents, then stopped before sending. For a moment, he saw Sarah as she had been 7 years earlier, barefoot in his old apartment, eating takeout noodles on the couch, and telling him he was the first man who made her feel safe without making her feel small. He had believed her. Maybe she had believed herself. But people change, and sometimes they do not become strangers all at once. Sometimes they become strangers one excuse at a time. John looked at her text one final time, then typed a reply that was shorter than the marriage deserved and calmer than the pain wanted. "Perfect. Then do not come home to my property." He pressed send, then sent the email to Rebecca, and in the quiet that followed, the city outside kept moving, while inside his office, the part of him that had been waiting for Sarah to choose him finally stood up and chose himself. Sarah did not reply for 11 minutes. And John spent every one of them discovering how long silence can feel when it follows the first honest boundary in years. He stayed seated at his office desk, hands folded, eyes on the phone, not because he was waiting to take the words back, but because some part of him still expected the old version of his wife to appear inside the screen and say she had gone too far. Instead, the typing bubble appeared, vanished, appeared again, and finally delivered a sentence sharp enough to tell him exactly which version of Sarah was answering. "You are proving my point." John read it once and set the phone face down. There was no point to prove anymore. There was only a pattern to stop funding. At 12:18, Rebecca Lawson called. Her voice was calm, professional, and free of the emotional fog that had made John excuse too much for too long. "I have reviewed the deed and lease records you sent," she said. "The Cherry Creek residence is premarital property under Whitman Holdings. If your wife is absent and you are initiating separation, we can prepare a written notice regarding access, occupancy expectations, and communication through counsel. Do not lock her out illegally. Do everything by paper." John almost smiled at that. Do everything by paper. Paper had no nostalgia. Paper did not remember Sarah dancing barefoot in his kitchen, or falling asleep with her head on his shoulder during snowstorms, or calling him steady like it was a blessing instead of a burden. Paper only remembered ownership, dates, signatures, and whether a person had mistaken generosity for entitlement. "Understood," he said. Rebecca continued. I also recommend pausing non-essential authorized user spending, not household necessities, and documenting all messages. If she comes to the house, keep communication calm and limited. She did not come home last night, John said. The sentence sounded stranger out loud. And do you know where she was? John looked through the glass wall of his office toward the conference room, where his assistant was setting out folders for a 1 o'clock meeting. Aspen, I think. Or near it. There was a resort charge pending. Rebecca was quiet for half a second. With the consultant? John did not answer. He did not need to. By mid-afternoon, Rebecca had sent the first draft notice. By 4:30, the non-essential authorized user charges were paused. By 5:15, Sarah called him for the first time all day. John let it go to voicemail. Then another call. Then another. Finally, a message arrived. What did you do to my card? He looked at the word my and felt the smallest, coldest clarity move through him. Not our card. Not the account. My card. He replied once. Rebecca Lawson will send formal communication. Essential household matters can go through email. Sarah called again immediately. This time, John answered but said nothing first. She came in hot, breathless, angry, with noise behind her that sounded like a hotel lobby. Are you serious right now? She demanded. You shut off my card because I told you not to treat me like property. John turned his chair toward the window. Denver was settling into evening, the mountains bruised purple behind the skyline. I paused non-essential spending on an account I pay, he said. You still have your own accounts. This is financial control. No, John said quietly. Control is demanding freedom while billing the consequences to someone else. The line went still. Somewhere behind her, a man's voice said something too low to catch. John closed his eyes for 1 second. Not from shock. From confirmation. Sarah lowered her voice. You are embarrassing me. There it was again. Not you are hurting. Not I should have called. Not I should have come home. Just embarrassment, the emotion people reach for when accountability arrives in public. Then go somewhere private, John said. Her breath caught. I am coming home tonight. He looked down at the property notice on his screen, then at the house security app showing the quiet front porch in Cherry Creek. Porch lights on, snow beginning to dust the steps. No, he said. You are not coming home to my property tonight. You will receive written instructions. If you need personal items, we will schedule a pickup properly. Sarah gave a bitter laugh, but it shook at the edges. You cannot just erase me from the house. John thought about the years she had slowly erased him from her plans, her honesty, her respect, then acted shocked when he finally erased his permission. I am not erasing you, he said. I am removing access to what you decided you were too free to respect. For once, Sarah had no immediate answer. The silence on the line felt different now. Less like absence, more like consequence. John ended the call before Sarah could turn silence into another accusation. He did not hang up hard. He did not need to. A gentle tap on the screen was enough to do what years of conversations had failed to do. In the loop. For a moment, he sat alone in his Denver office, watching snow gather along the ledges outside, the city turning silver under evening light. His phone buzzed again almost immediately, then again, then again. He let every call pass. The old John would have answered, not because he was weak, but because he had been trained by love to treat her distress as an emergency. This time, he treated it as information. Sarah was not scared when she stayed away all night. She was not concerned when he called to make sure she was safe. She was not troubled when she told him not to contact her. She became outraged only when the privileges attached to him stopped following her into places where respect did not. That distinction mattered. At 6:05, Rebecca sent the formal notice, and John read it carefully before approving the final version. It did not sound emotional. It sounded clean. Temporary separation. Premarital residence. Scheduled retrieval of personal belongings. Written communication through counsel. Authorized user spending review. No direct confrontation. The words were dry enough to feel almost merciful. They took the heat out of pain and replaced it with structure. John forwarded the notice to Sarah's email and copied Rebecca. Then he shut down his office computer, placed the printed property file into his briefcase, and drove home through slow traffic toward Cherry Creek. The house was dark when he arrived except for the porch lights and the soft glow of the security panel in the entryway. It was a beautiful home, stone and glass, with heated floors, high ceilings, and a kitchen Sarah had once said made her feel like she had finally arrived somewhere. John had bought it before her, back when his company was smaller and every investment still felt like a risk. He remembered signing the closing documents alone, standing in the empty living room with a paper cup of gas station coffee, promising himself that one day the house would hold warmth, not just value. For a while it had. Sarah used to dance barefoot across the kitchen while pasta boiled, used to fall asleep under a blanket on the couch while snow piled against the windows, used to tell guests that John had given her peace. But peace is fragile when one person starts mistaking it for dullness. He walked through the room slowly, not out of nostalgia, but inventory. Her coat still hung in the front closet. Her shoes lined the mudroom. A half-finished glass of sparkling water sat beside a lifestyle magazine in the sunroom, open to an article about mountain retreats. On the kitchen island lay a receipt from a boutique in Vail and a folded napkin from a restaurant John had never visited. He did not touch either one. He took photographs, dated, and stored them in the folder Rebecca had created. Evidence does not need anger to matter. Upstairs, the bedroom felt colder than the rest of the house. Sarah's side of the closet was a bright, expensive mess of dresses, boots, garment bags, and weekend luggage. His side was organized, almost severe. John packed a small overnight bag for himself anyway. Not because he was leaving the house, but because he no longer wanted to sleep in a room where loyalty had been treated like a service plan. He chose the guest suite down the hall, changed the passcode to the primary bedroom safe, and placed the property file on the desk. At 7:34, the doorbell camera alerted. Sarah stood on the porch in a cream coat, hair windblown, face flushed from cold and anger. Behind her, a black SUV idled at the curb. Through the camera speaker, her voice came sharp and breathless. "John, open the door. This is ridiculous." He watched from the hallway monitor, calm but not untouched. Seeing her there still hurt. Hurt does not disappear just because a man is right. He pressed the intercom button. "Check your email. Rebecca has sent instructions." Sarah stared into the camera as if the glass itself had betrayed her. "You are really going to make me stand outside my own home?" John looked around the entryway, at the floors he paid for, the walls he repaired, the home she had used as proof of freedom while calling his concern ownership. "No," he said. "I am asking you to stand outside mine until we handle this properly." Her expression faltered, and for the first time that day, anger did not arrive fast enough to cover fear. Sarah stood on the porch for almost a full minute, staring into the camera as if she could force the door open by refusing to accept that it had become a boundary. Snow gathered in her hair and on the shoulders of her cream coat, melting into dark spots that made her look less polished than she wanted to appear. The black SUV at the curb idled with its headlights on, and through the windshield, John could see the outline of a man in the driver's seat, one hand resting high on the steering wheel. Brandon Cole. He did not need confirmation. The posture was enough. Men like Brandon enjoyed blurred lines until those lines required names, addresses, and consequences. Sarah glanced back at the SUV, then leaned closer to the camera. "John, I need my things," she said, changing her tone from anger to injured reason. "You cannot keep me from my clothes, my laptop, my medication, any of it." John stood in the hallway with one hand resting near the monitor and the other in his pocket, grounding himself before answering. "You will have access to your personal belongings by appointment. Rebecca's email explains the process." Sarah let out a short laugh that fogged the cold air. "An appointment? You are treating me like a tenant." He looked through the screen at the woman who had spent months insisting she was independent whenever accountability appeared, and he felt the old ache rise, the urge to soften the moment so she would stop sounding wounded. He let the urge pass. "I am treating this like a separation," he said, "because that is what your choices made it." Her face tightened. "My choices? You are the one who changed the rules overnight." "No," John said quietly. "You changed them when you decided the marriage no longer required respect, communication, or coming home. I only stopped pretending the old rules still applied." Sarah looked away, and for a second the sharpness slipped. He could see the calculation behind her eyes, the quick inventory of what she could still use. Guilt, history, tears, outrage. She had once used tenderness there too, real tenderness, the kind that made him believe every argument had a door back to love. But that door had been boarded up one excuse at a time. The SUV door opened. Brandon stepped out into the snow wearing a dark wool coat, and the uncertain confidence of a man who had not expected to become visible. He stayed near the vehicle at first, then walked halfway up the driveway. Sarah turned and whispered something to him with her hand over the side of her mouth, as if the camera could not read body language. John pressed the record function on the security system. Not for drama, for accuracy. Brandon lifted both hands slightly, trying to appear reasonable. John, man, maybe just let her grab a bag so this does not get ugly. John almost smiled at the word man. They had met twice at charity events, both times with Brandon shaking his hand too firmly and calling Sarah brilliant in a way that felt rehearsed. Now he stood in John's driveway, beside John's wife, outside John's house, giving advice about ugly. John pressed the intercom again. Brandon, this is a legal separation matter. You should leave before you become part of the documentation. Brandon's expression changed first to surprise, then irritation, then caution. Caution 1. He stepped back toward the SUV. Sarah watched him retreat, and something in her face flickered. For months, she had spoken of freedom as if it came with applause, hotel lobbies, mountain weekends, and men who admired her ambition without asking who paid for the room. Now freedom was standing on a snowy porch while the man inside the house refused to keep financing the fantasy. Her voice dropped. John, please. Can we talk without lawyers for 5 minutes? He looked at her through the camera, then toward the staircase where her belongings waited behind walls he had paid for before he ever knew her name. We talked without lawyers for years, he said. You called it control whenever I asked for honesty. Her eyes filled, but he did not move toward the door. Compassion without boundaries had become the language she used to re-enter rooms she had disrespected. At 7:49, Rebecca called. John answered on speaker, but kept the intercom muted. I see the camera alert, Rebecca said. Do not open the door while the third party is present. Offer a scheduled retrieval tomorrow with a neutral witness. Email confirmation only. Understood. Sarah knocked then, not hard, but enough for the sound to travel through the house like a memory, trying one last time to become authority. John ended the call, unmuted the intercom, and said, tomorrow at 10. Rebecca will arrange a neutral pickup. Bring no one unless they are named in writing. Sarah stared at the camera, tears finally spilling, less dramatic than he expected, and somehow more painful because of it. So this is who you are now? She asked. John thought of the first apartment, the takeout noodles, the promises, the years when love felt like building shelter together. Then he looked at the black SUV, the snow, the glass between them, and the house that had mistaken his patience for an unlimited invitation. No, he said. This is who I should have been when respect first left. He released the intercom button. Sarah stood there a moment longer, then turned slowly toward the waiting SUV. As Brandon opened the passenger door for her, John saw that he did not touch her shoulder, did not step between her and the cold, did not look like a man ready to inherit the trouble he had helped create. The SUV pulled away, leaving 2 faint tire tracks in the snow. John watched until the porch was empty, then saved the footage, turned off the hallway light, and walked toward the guest suite, feeling the strange quiet of a house that had finally stopped apologizing for belonging to him. John sat quietly in the study, the soft hum of the heating system filling the room as he opened the folder labeled with Sarah's name. The documents inside were carefully organized, each paper representing months of decisions, conflicts, and attempts at compromise. His eyes lingered on the familiar handwriting of emails and notes, reminders of moments when communication had failed and his patience had been stretched thin. Outside, the winter afternoon light cast long shadows across the hardwood floor, and the faint sound of car doors closing echoed from the driveway, where Brandon had parked a second vehicle, the tires crunching over the snow, signaling his reluctant compliance with the arrangement John had insisted upon. He leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the past few weeks, recalling the small confrontations, the subtle manipulations, and the quiet assertions of independence that Sarah had woven into daily interactions, each one a stitch in the fabric of the life they had once shared but could no longer sustain. The intercom beeped softly, indicating a message from Rebecca, confirming that the neutral witness would be present during the scheduled pickup of Sarah's remaining belongings, ensuring that the exchange proceeded without incident. John exhaled, releasing tension he had carried for too long, knowing that control was necessary not out of spite, but to preserve clarity and boundaries he had once neglected. He thought about the driving forces that led them here, the choices made in haste, and the lessons learned in the quiet aftermath, the weight of accountability settling over him as he read and reread the instructions for the day, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Across the room, a photograph of their early years together rested on the mantel, a reminder of the shared dreams, the laughter, and the fleeting moments of unguarded happiness that had preceded the gradual unraveling of trust and mutual respect. John rose, moving toward the window to glance at the street below, watching the world continue its indifferent rhythm, the footprints in the snow already beginning to fade, symbolic of the impermanence of presence and the inevitability of change. He returned to the folder, meticulously checking off each item, the precision a small comfort amid the emotional turbulence that lingered like a winter draft. His mind traced the sequence of events, evaluating each decision, each response, and the chain reaction that had brought them to this point, aware that in the coming hours, reconciliation and confrontation would exist side by side, and the need for composure would be paramount. Outside, Sarah and Brandon waited patiently, the vehicle idling, a stark contrast to the calculated stillness within the house. John adjusted the chair, straightened the papers, and checked the clock, knowing that the intersection of timing, presence, and procedure would define the interaction to come. He stepped back, allowing space for the encounter, and prepared himself to manage the process with the calm and authority he had cultivated, recognizing that the closure sought here was not just physical but emotional, the final acknowledgement of boundaries, accountability, and the shifting dynamics of relationships tested by time, circumstance, and choices that could not be undone. In the silence before the meeting, he reviewed his approach once more, considering tone, pacing, and the subtle cues necessary to maintain dignity and control, aware that the delicate balance between firmness and fairness would determine the effectiveness of the day's proceedings, and that every action, every word, carried weight far beyond the immediate moment. John adjusted the folder in his hands as the doorbell rang softly, signaling the arrival of the mediator who would oversee the final exchange of items, each representing years of shared history, conflicts, and moments of fragile understanding. He stepped into the hallway, feeling the weight of anticipation, knowing that every action today would carry consequences beyond the immediate scene, influencing perceptions and emotions in subtle yet lasting ways. Outside, the winter sunlight reflected off the icy driveway, highlighting footprints that marked Sarah's path as she approached with Brandon, her expression a careful mixture of apprehension and determination, aware that the dynamics had shifted dramatically since their last encounter. John exhaled quietly, recalling the meticulous preparations, the attention to detail in organizing documents, ensuring that each item to be exchanged was accounted for, labeled correctly, and handled with care, reflecting the precision he had developed to maintain control and clarity in situations fraught with potential tension. The mediator entered, nodding politely, and John guided them into the living room, arranging chairs to provide neutral space, balancing proximity with comfort, allowing everyone to maintain personal space while facilitating necessary communication. Sarah glanced around, noting the arrangement, and adjusted her coat, a gesture of readiness and awareness, signaling her intent to proceed with composure. John handed over the first envelope, containing critical documents, watching her reaction carefully, noting subtle shifts in posture, the micro-expressions that conveyed unspoken acknowledgement of boundaries, responsibilities, and the structured fairness he had insisted upon. Brandon remained attentive, offering quiet support, understanding the importance of the process and the necessity of maintaining calm, his presence reinforcing a sense of safety and observation. Throughout the exchange, John maintained an even tone, clear and deliberate, articulating instructions for each step, ensuring no detail was overlooked, and that all participants understood the sequence of actions. The winter light shifted subtly, casting a warm glow across the room, softening the edges of tension and providing a sense of temporal continuity, reminding them all of the passage of time, the impermanence of conflict, and the potential for reflection and growth. As the final items were exchanged and checked off the list, John allowed a brief pause, giving space for acknowledgement, understanding, and the silent recognition of change. The mediator concluded with a summary, reinforcing the structure and fairness of the day's proceedings, and everyone absorbed the resolution, aware of the balance struck between assertion, cooperation, and closure. John finally returned to his chair, reflecting on the careful orchestration, the deliberate actions taken to ensure dignity, fairness, and clarity, appreciating the nuanced interactions that had defined the process and anticipating the way these structured resolutions would influence future encounters and relationships, all while maintaining the composure and awareness cultivated through experience and mindful preparation. After the mediator finished the checklist, Sarah stood in the living room with 2 garment bags over one arm and a small box of personal items at her feet, but she did not move toward the door. Brandon waited near the entryway, pretending to study a framed landscape print while clearly wishing the process would end before it became more personal than he had prepared for. The neutral witness, a retired court clerk named Helen, kept her clipboard in hand and watched with the patient stillness of someone who had seen too many couples discover that the hardest things to divide are not written on inventory sheets. John remained beside the fireplace, calm, quiet, and careful not to stand too close to Sarah or too far away to seem cruel. The house smelled faintly of cedar, coffee, and winter air from the door opening and closing. Sunlight fell across the hardwood floor where Sarah had once danced barefoot during a spring dinner party, laughing while John turned music up from the kitchen speaker. Now her boots stood on that same floor beside a taped cardboard box labeled personal clothing and documents. Life has a strange way of making ordinary rooms testify. Sarah looked toward the staircase, then toward the kitchen, then finally at John. "So that is it?" she asked. Her voice was softer than it had been on the porch, but softness had become complicated between them. John glanced at Helen, who gave no reaction, then looked back at Sarah. "For today, yes." Sarah swallowed. "You make it sound like a transaction." John let the words settle before answering. "A transaction has clear terms. That is more than we had for a while." Brandon shifted near the door, uncomfortable with a truth that included him without naming him. Sarah noticed the movement and her face tightened, not with embarrassment exactly, but with the first hint of realizing that her freedom had an audience too. "I never wanted it to become this cold," she said. John looked at the box by her feet, at the coat she had chosen carefully, at the expensive weekend bag he knew came from a trip she once claimed was only for work. "Neither did I." The answer surprised her because it was not an attack. It left her nowhere to defend herself from. For a moment, the house was quiet enough for the heating system to click behind the wall. Then Sarah said, "Brandon has nothing to do with the house." John's eyes moved briefly to Brandon, then back to her. "I agree. That is why he should not have come to it." Brandon looked down. Helen marked something on her clipboard, the small scratch of her pen louder than it should have been. Sarah's eyes filled, but this time John saw exhaustion beneath the performance. "I said that text because I felt trapped," she whispered. "I felt like every question came with a bill attached." John nodded slowly, not because he agreed, but because he had learned the difference between hearing someone and surrendering to their version of events. "I asked where you were because you did not come home," he said. "I called because I was worried. You answered by accusing me of ownership while standing inside a life built almost entirely from what I had trusted you with." Sarah lowered her gaze. "I know that sounds bad." "It does not sound bad," John said. "It is bad." The words landed without anger, which made them heavier. She wiped under one eye with the side of her finger. "I thought if I made myself sound independent, I would feel less guilty." There it was. Not all of it, maybe not enough, but more honesty than she had given him in months. John felt the old part of him rise, the part trained to comfort her when truth finally cost her something. He held it back with both hands inside himself. "Independence is not taking whatever support is convenient and calling accountability control," he said. Sarah looked at him then, really looked, and he could see her understanding what the locked door had meant. It had not been punishment. It had been translation. The house, the cards, the car, the late-night concern, the patience, the second chances, all of it had been mistaken for something endless because he had never put a fence around it. Helen cleared her throat gently. "Mrs. Whitman, we should complete the departure." Sarah nodded, but before she lifted the box, she looked once more toward the kitchen island. "I used to feel safe here," she said. John followed her gaze. "So did I. That was the first thing he said all morning that made her cry without trying to hide it. Brandon stepped forward to take the box, but Sarah shook her head and picked it up herself. Maybe pride, maybe accountability, maybe just the weight she needed to feel. At the door, she paused. Will you ever talk to me without Rebecca? John opened the door, and cold Denver air moved into the foyer. Maybe someday, he said, but not while you still confuse access with love. Sarah stepped outside, and this time she did not argue. Brandon followed her down the walkway, carrying nothing but his own discomfort. John watched until the SUV pulled away, then closed the door softly. The house became quiet again, but not empty. Empty was what he had feared. Quiet, he realized, was something different. Quiet was the sound of a boundary finally holding. After Sarah left, John stood in the foyer for a long time with his hand resting on the closed door, listening to the fading sound of the SUV until even the tire tracks outside seemed quieter than memory. The house had not changed in any visible way. The same winter light crossed the hardwood. The same coat hooks lined the wall. The same kitchen waited beyond the hallway, polished and still, with 2 coffee mugs in the cabinet that had once meant routine instead of evidence. But something inside the house had shifted because something inside John had finally stopped negotiating with disrespect. He walked back into the living room, picked up the folder Helen had signed, and placed it on the desk in his study beside Rebecca Lawson's notice. The paperwork looked cold, but it had done what emotion could not. It had drawn a line clear enough for everyone to see, including him. For years, John had believed love meant keeping every door open, even when the person walking through it brought confusion, accusation, and silence behind them. He had thought patience was proof of devotion. He had thought understanding meant absorbing every contradiction until Sarah eventually remembered who he was. But standing there in the quiet Cherry Creek house, he understood that love without respect becomes maintenance, and maintenance without boundaries becomes a job no heart was meant to perform. He opened the security app one last time, saved the footage from the morning, and watched a still image of Sarah on the porch with her box in her arms. Not as punishment, not as a trophy, as a reminder. She had asked not to be treated like property, and she was right about one thing. No person belongs to another. But neither does a person have the right to treat someone else's loyalty, home, money, patience, and concern like public utilities that stay on no matter how they are spoken to. John poured himself coffee, this time for one, and stood by the kitchen window while snow softened the street outside. He did not feel victorious. Victory would have required him to still be competing. What he felt was steadier than that. It was the relief of no longer chasing an explanation from someone who had used confusion as cover. Later that afternoon, Rebecca called to confirm the next steps. Written communication only. Property boundaries maintained. Financial review underway. Personal items retrieved. John answered each point clearly, then thanked her and ended the call. No drama. No speeches. No door slammed hard enough for neighbors to hear. Just structure where chaos had once kept finding a way in. As evening settled over Denver, the house grew warm under soft lamps, and John sat in the study where the framed photograph from their early years still rested on the mantel. He did not take it down. Not yet. Some memories do not need to be destroyed to lose their power. Sometimes they simply become part of a room you no longer let them control. He looked at the empty chair across from his desk and thought about Sarah asking if they would ever talk without lawyers. Maybe someday, when honesty was no longer being used as a last resort. Maybe never. Either way, John finally understood that closure was not always an apology, a reconciliation, or a dramatic goodbye. Sometimes closure was a passcode changed, a card paused, a door kept closed, and a man learning that protecting his peace did not make him cruel. It made him awake. So tell me honestly, if someone rejected your care as control but still expected access to everything your care provided, would you open the door again, or would you finally let the boundary stand? And if this story made you think about respect, marriage, accountability, and the quiet strength it takes to choose dignity over endless explanations, stay with this channel. Because sometimes the most powerful answer is not a fight. It is a calm door, a clear line, and a life that no longer apologizes for belonging to you.